Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Mushiri Nyaga. Thank you for joining us on this webinar on data governance and capabilities in Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm from the Local Development Research Institute, which is an implementing partner for the Global Data Barometer and part of the Data for Development Global Research Hub, also known as D4D.net. Today's webinar will unpack some issues around data governance, especially around data protection. And we will also touch a little bit on the Global Data Barometer, which I'd encourage you to check out on globaldatabarometer.org. The Global Data Barometer was a multidimensional and multi-layered study that assessed the state of data for public good in 109 countries. It's an expert survey. It was conducted from May 2019 to May 2021 to create a new global benchmark that looks at data governance, capability, availability, and use and impact of data for public good. That report shows that there's been a great deal of progress in establishing the data protection frameworks that we all felt we needed many years ago. But in many countries, these tend to have gaps and weaknesses that reduce the accountability that comes built in with these frameworks, ideally, and also reduces the effectiveness with exclusions on data protection that leave out certain parts of the public sector or certain elements of data sharing, notifications of breaches and things like that, which are very important for protecting the rights of citizens. The capabilities question tends to be a little bit different. The report shows that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done on that. And I think one of the issues that has jumped out at me, maybe because I live in a country with a devolved system of government, is how those data capabilities are not as strong and or present in the subnational layer of governments. And this is where a lot of our administrative data is collected, a lot of it is managed there, and a lot of our citizens have touch points with government at that subnational level. So the capabilities question at the national level, at the federal level, if you're in federal government, is critical for ensuring that your citizens have access to the data they need, that your public sector has access to the data it needs, but that everyone accesses and uses that data in ways that are responsible and protect the rights of individuals. So I will stop there in my rant. And encourage you to have a look at the globaldatabarometer.org website where the report is. You can look at the data, you can download it and analyze it on your own, or you can look at the visualizations that have been pre-done on the site and see just how your country is doing or how your region is doing based on the various dimensions and the pillars of the barometer. So today I'm joined by an eminent panel of people who've been studying and working on these issues in this space, and they'll help us to unpack this a little. I'm joined by I'll introduce them all, and then we'll start the conversation. Angeline Wairegi, who's an experienced research scientist working on issues of artificial intelligence in the African continent. She's an educator with a proven track record in effectively instructing large and small-sized classrooms in institutions of higher learning, designing educational and training programs for scholars in the scientific field, and in successfully managing and conducting complex research projects. She has a comprehensive technological and pedagogical knowledge on the best practices of designing educational programs for both online and conventional classrooms that cater to the educational needs of diverse student populations, as well as the strategies required for carrying out systematic, comprehensive, and successful research projects. I'm also joined by Dr. Tomiwa Elori, who's currently a postdoctoral researcher at the Expression Information Unit of the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. His research interests include international human rights law, digital rights, the African human rights system, ICT for development, and the various policy impacts of digital and new technologies on human rights. He has authored several publications on these issues and worked with various state and non-state actors on rights-respecting approaches to digital and new technologies. Also joined by Jenna Slotin. Jenna is a Senior Director of Policy for the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. She leads the Global Partnership's efforts to build a movement advocating for a fair data future and to support partners across sectors to realize that vision globally and locally. Prior to this, she was Director of the Sustainable Development Policy for Sustainable Development Policy at the United Nations Foundation. She has over 15 years of experience at the UN and working on UN policy issues related to sustainable development and peace building, with a particular focus on the 2030 agenda and the UN's peace building architecture. She has project management and leadership experience. She's worked at the UNDP as the CEO for Building Markets. She's published on data governance and digital inclusion. And she's co-managed the research program on peace building at the International Peace Institute. Then we're also joined by Francis Monyango. He's an experienced privacy and data protection practitioner based in Nairobi. He's an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and a certified information privacy professional. Has experience in internet governance and digital rights, a special interest in data protection, compliance, privacy by design, commercial concepts, freedom of expression online, and e-commerce in Africa. He has experience in public affairs and government relations, having served as a public policy manager at Oxygen MCL, where he also doubled up as the data protection officer. This panel represents many years of research and experience, and the insights I'm sure each one of you hold are invaluable for this conversation. So maybe first I'd like to welcome Angeline, Dr. Wairegi. Maybe we could take a minute maybe and tell us a little bit about CPIT and what this CPIT, the center, does.
Sure. So CPIT, which is the Center for Information the Center for Intellectual Property and Information Technology Law, it's a mouthful, is a research center that is based in Nairobi, Kenya. We are housed under Strathmore University, and primarily what we do is academic research, and we focus on IP and ICT issues. We currently have 4 different departments that are all really related to data in one way or another. So we have our AI4D Policy Center, which looks at issues around artificial intelligence on the African continent. We have our IP department, which focuses on intellectual property concerns. We have our ICT, which is really focusing on emerging technologies and all the adjacent issues. And then we have our Data Governance Policy Center, which is the one that is primarily just looking at data-centric matters, and we try to do that in a very holistic way. So we look at the legislative concerns, we look at what the impact of data policies are, we looked at enforcement, regulatory practices. So we try and really look at data in every single way that we think is relevant to the global South and more specifically to the African continent.
Excellent. I've been a big fan of CPIT's work for a while. And you've been at the forefront of advocacy on data protection, privacy, cybersecurity, and some of the IP law that you've mentioned, with some really on the bleeding edge ideas and insights. And I was just wondering, based on what you've seen over time, which thematic areas are you seeing the most progress when it comes to data governance, and which ones are still a source of great concern?
So, like you said, Mushiri, we've been in this game for 10 years now. This year is actually a 10-year anniversary since CPIT was conceptualized and started its work.
Congratulations.
So, thank you. 10 years. I had nothing to do with it. I've only been here for 2 years.
Happy birthday.
So we've been at this quite a long time, and I think that there's a lot of things to be encouraged about in the data sphere. I'll talk about 3. So 1 is legislation, 2 is interest, and then kind of as an offshoot of that, advocacy. So as far as legislation goes, I think there's been such a substantial increase with countries that actually have data protection or data privacy laws in one form or another. In the past 3 years alone, since 2019, I think we've had 7 countries who enacted data protection laws. So I think that is great. And to go along with that has actually been a push to set up enforcement frameworks as well. So how successful or non-successful is another thing, but I think just overall, the approach that government is taking as far as data privacy policies and legislation is something to be lauded, and it's something that we've been really encouraged by. The other thing is just interest in general, both from the public sector and the private sector surrounding data issues. So if you just look at 10 years ago, the amount of discourse that was being had on digital activities and the resultant data and all the concerns surrounding that, whether it be data exploitation or data privacy, was very, very minimal. But right now, there are a lot of organizations, there are a lot of private business entities, a lot of civil society organizations, and also a lot of government organizations that are really, really, really interested in this dialogue and are actively participating in this dialogue, and actually reach out to academic people or civil society people to get their input. So I think that's something that's also been really encouraging that we've seen. And then kind of as an offshoot of that is advocacy. The number of organizations, whether it's civil society organizations or it's people in the legal field or it's non-governmental, NGOs, the number of people who have actually been pushing these issues and who've been voicing their concerns and who've been voicing the concerns of people who don't have a platform or access to a platform where they can make their concerns known has been great. And I think a lot of, let me speak specifically to Kenya, there's been a lot of substantive progress and a lot of substantive change made from the activities from civil society organizations while they were advocating for, the wananchi, the people who are not even clued into why data is important or how it can impact them. So advocacy, I think, is just something that's strengthening. It's going from strength to strength as we go throughout the years in the data sphere. So I think those are some of the encouraging things that we've seen across the board. As far as issues of concern, I think I'd like to touch on 3 as well. So legislation. I know it's encouraging, but it's also slightly concerning as well in terms of how it's progressing and what it's looking like. So that's one area I'd like to talk about. And then capacity. Capacity generally, in this case, I mean in terms of enforcement capacity. That's something I think that I would also like to touch upon. And then capacity also as far as knowledge acquisition and knowledge dissemination around these issues relating to data. So yes, there's been a lot of legislation enacted in the last 10 years around data protection. But what we're seeing is that it's one, we have a little less or a little over half of the 55 African countries that actually have a data protection acts, which means we have, a little less than half that don't have anything regulating data. And then even in countries where we do have data protection acts, or data privacy acts, or, other forms of data protection legislation, it's very varied. So we have some that are very minimal in terms of how they restrict how data can be collected, processed, utilized. And then we have some that are a lot more robust. So there isn't standardized legislation across the board. I know that the Maloba Convention had been developed and some countries have ratified it, but there's been, I guess, installed. I don't know if that's the right word. There's been very little progress as far as the ratification of the Malabo Convention, and some of the clauses in it and the mandates are a little out of step right now. So that is a source of concern. Also, kind of related to that, yes, we have this legislation in place. We have these acts that have been enacted. We have these policies, but what does that mean in terms of actually enforcing them? Like if you don't have enforcement frameworks, then these laws have no teeth, right? They're just words on a paper. And I think that is another source of concern. CIPID actually mapped the number of active regulatory offices in the concerning data in Africa, and I'll put that in the chat in a little bit. And the active offices were actually less than the number of data protection acts out there, right? So I think we have what, like 30 something data protection acts, but the number of regulatory offices that are specific to data that we found were less than that. And also, if we do have the offices in place, are they well staffed? Is the staff well versed on the legislature, the laws and the policies that's guiding them, right? So those are things that we don't actually know. And the other thing is, as far as enforcement, we have seen some cases brought in Kenya where we can say, okay, the law, the DPA that we have, Kenya's Data Protection Act, it does have a little bit of force or some teeth behind it, right? So we've seen that, but that's not the case across the board. In some places, there hasn't been anything that's actually been brought up in trial to see whether, you know, the acts they have, whether they stand up when they're actually tried by either non-compliance or exploitation or other things like that. So that's one area of concern that we have. The other is knowledge. I think there is just knowledge asymmetry. There's such an entrenched knowledge asymmetry practice, I guess, I don't know how to phrase that, as far as data and digital activities is concerned on the continent. We see the same voices, and I think, Mashiri, you pointed this out earlier. It's the same voices, the same faces over and over again when we're having this kind of dialogue. And that's because, one, I don't think there's been a sufficient push by either private entities or the public sector to actually educate the public on what data is and why is it important and why should they be paying attention, because if they don't know the first two, they don't know what data is and they don't know how it can impact them and its importance, then they're not really going to be paying attention, right? That's something for other people to worry about. There hasn't been really, in my opinion, sufficient push to set up educational platforms, training facilities, or just like PSAs or something to let people know why data is important. And if because of this persistent knowledge asymmetries, I think there is also a very big danger about the disenfranchisement of marginalized and vulnerable groups. Because if they don't know anything about data, they're not included in these dialogues, then the policies and the frameworks and the structures are being set by people who are not really concerned about their needs and their priorities, right? So there's a real danger because of this knowledge asymmetry to create a power asymmetry, and because of the power asymmetry, we lead to widening inequalities from this data-centric world that we're living in because of this datafication of everyday activities. So I think those are the three main areas of concern that we're seeing in our research.
Thank you, and I think well, some of what you said tracks with the GDB report as well, and also areas Tomiwa has looked at in some of his work, and Jenna, the issue of inclusivity. I'm sure she'll have a few things to say about that. But before we go to Tomiwa, especially because of his lens on participatory approaches and getting the public more interested, which is that whole knowledge area. Just want to let everyone know that you can put in any questions you have. If you're on our live events page, on your right, there's a box there with Q&A and polls. If you click on Q&A, you can post in any question you might have, and we have a poll running actually on that. So feel free to go in there and give your thoughts. It's a very quick question. How would you rate the state of data governance in your country? So as we have this conversation, you might go, maybe it's a 2, and then maybe think, okay, maybe it's a 1. or maybe it's a 10, who knows? But do jump in there and add your thoughts. Would be great to hear. If you have any questions, and you can direct them to a specific person on the panel, please do so. But we'll be happy to bring the conversation to the floor. Yeah, so I think with that little bit of additional housekeeping, Tomiwa, you worked on a report on maximizing public awareness for participatory data governance in African countries. You advocate for participatory approaches to data policy, and a lot of that participation really does require the general public to be engaged, to be interested, and participate. Just based on some of our experience around budgets and agriculture policy, etc. I'm wondering how do you go about that? How do you go about getting the public interested in this issue? That knowledge gap that Angeline was alluding to, in her remarks.
Thank you so much, Machiri, for the introduction, and also for Angeline's very insightful background. So there are actually no silver bullets. Actually, there are no manuals in getting the public more interested in participatory data governance. And the reason why I say that is because this is not a space or a conversation that is a decade old yet. This is an ongoing conversation that keeps taking on several forms, and is quite dynamic. And Angeline also mentioned earlier that there has been quite some progress that has been made. I mean, compare maybe 10 years ago, where we started from clamoring for data protection laws, and fast forward 10 years later, now we have at least more than half of African countries, at least with data protection laws and all that. But the way I see this is, I think there's a very, and I find the topic of the webinar also quite interesting, because there's a very strong relationship between governance, data governance, and capability. And that is where I think my report, the one I authored recently for the Center for Study of African Economies, comes in on how to maximize public awareness for participatory data governance. In my view, when we talk about data governance, we cannot remove it or divorce it from capability, because it's actually capability and capacity that ensures and delivers effective governance. And and capability can be understood in a number of ways. In the context of this discussion, it could mean the readiness of African systems and institutions to support effective data governance policies. And it could also mean an opportunity to assess the viability of these systems and profile ways of improving them. And this is, in my view, where the report that I authored comes in. Participatory data governance can improve the viability of African institutions and systems to support effective data governance. And one of the ways of achieving this is ensuring more public awareness in order to drive ground-up, bottom-up participatory data governance. And the reason why this is necessary is because it could help galvanize the needed interest, especially from the public with respect to data governance issues. And in my view, I think this can be done in a couple of ways. And this couple of ways also, I would like to also note that, like I said earlier, there are no manuals, but because there are no manuals doesn't mean we cannot think towards more effective solutions, especially on how to ensure that the public actually participates. And based on that report and some of the findings that were made, there were quite a lot of challenges that impede participation. Also, with respect to data governance, for example, there is already an ongoing lethargy, with respect to on the part of the public to even want to get involved in any public policy issues in the first place, not even data governance issues right now, and this is attributable to people don't think that they will be heard even when they have legitimate issues of concerns for policymakers to address. So that really contributes to how the typical African public will want to engage with data governance issues. Besides that, there's also the challenge of even policymakers not knowing where their work is cut out for them. There's also the challenge of, for example, when you look at most, Angeline mentioned earlier that even though we now have increased data protection laws across the region, it doesn't necessarily translate to implementation. For example, data protection authorities are not yet in full swing, even in instances where you have laws that provide for them. And even for those that have data protection authorities, when you look at their national or annual maybe strategy or the periodic strategy plans that they have, you find out that there is little or next to no information on how to improve awareness or drive participation from the ground up. And these are institutions that are most proximate to ensuring implementation of data governance and protection in African context. So we see that even at the institutional level, that there's a challenge. The institutions that are supposed to know the technical and non-technical know-how of data protection and governance in African countries. And in my view, I think one of the suggested ways there are like 4 ways that I think I identify that can be used to help drive more participation with respect to data governance issues in Africa. Number 1 is making data governance policy information processes, developing these policies in African countries more accessible. And one of the ways this can be done is ensuring both specific capacity building for stakeholders and also general capacity building for stakeholders. And what do I mean by that? For example, judicial oversight is an important aspect, of data protection. It will be useful at some point to have specific capacity workshops that are, geared solely towards judicial officers. Not only, maybe we can start with a couple of pilot African countries to help drive more, knowledge of judicial officers to understand how, policies can be set through judicial oversight in many African countries on data governance issues. So those are examples of, specific governance, capacity building for stakeholders on data governance issues. And it could also involve, specific training for government institutions, executive branches, government agencies, institutions that continue. For example, the amendment of countries that have ministries and departments, parastatals that deal with statistics. How do you deal with personal information of the public, for example? Many countries have elections coming up. How do the electoral commissions and bodies treat personal information of electorates and all of that? These are one of the ways you can help drive more participatory governance by providing more awareness to specific stakeholders. And it could also be general, where you can pull a number of proximate stakeholders together to discuss data governance issues and discuss way forward. Because I believe that one of the ways to ensure more public awareness on these issues is actually to start by conversations, by dialogues, by roundtables, and having people present what their challenges are and how to walk backwards from there. So in addition to that, how we can make data governance more accessible. One example is also developing data policies and explaining them, creating awareness on them using African local languages. Except for maybe a couple of countries, maybe Tanzania. I've seen an example of Tanzania, and also a very limited example in Kenya, but more in South Africa. You see that there are very limited conversations on how to drive public awareness on data governance issues using local languages. I don't know why that is. I don't know if we as digital rights advocates or data governance advocates are shy of our languages, and I don't think that should be, or I don't think that is the case. I want to believe that's not the case. But we should also begin to think through how we want to approach more awareness by sharing information in Kiswahili, for example, in Ndebele, in Yoruba, in Luganda. I'm very curious on how that kind of awareness can drive participation, especially from the grassroots level. So that is one aspect, one idea that I think might help us, drive more participation at the more local level and to ensure more participation. The second consideration or suggestion is, in my view, I think it would be useful to develop a national data governance philosophy. And what I mean by that is that, for me, most of our governance policies in African national context, sometimes it's just everywhere, right? There is no harmonized strategy towards what the government and other stakeholders think about how data should be governed. And in my view, that needs to be where we start from. We need to curate that idea, and as a result of that, move from there. And that, in my view, should help inform what becomes our laws and how we intend to implement them. So we sort of have a roadmap. So in my view, I think, at the risk of more duplicated, not wanting to duplicate efforts, I think it would be useful to have a more dedicated, strategic, focused national data governance plan for each African countries. I think Rwanda has something similar to that, their policy on the data governance policy. But even at that, there's still some challenges with respect to the Rwandan example. And I think that's one of the ways we can begin to, start more conversation on what participation means also at national level on data governance issues. And thirdly, I think we also need more research. It is great what your organization is doing, Muchiri, in trying to, fill that gap. But I think that we still need to do more, especially in carrying out both quantitative and qualitative research on data governance aspects and issues in African countries. And lastly, I also think that it would be very useful to create, a peer learning system on data governance issues among African states. And in my view, I'm fine with other sound and more logical arguments for that. But in my view, I think that it would be nice to house that kind of idea in the already existing organizations for national data, for data protection authorities. For countries to learn from each other, for example, what is the information regulator in South Africa doing that might be useful for the data protection authority in Malawi or in Angola or in Uganda or in Kenya or in any other African country? What are the challenges that a particular data governance landscape is facing, and how have they been able to surmount? And if they've not been able to surmount, how can other states also pull heads together to help push that particular challenge in that particular context forward? So, and I'm saying this because that is also like a facet of participation also at that level to other among states, in order to be able to learn from each other and ensure that at the base of such a strategy is participation of the average African person who, I hope in maybe a decade or more would be able to understand over the top of their head exactly when their personal information is used properly or where it has been misused, and also understand the kind of remedies or systems available for them to seek redress. So that is the way I think about ensuring and galvanizing for more support more participatory data governance issues in African context. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Tomiwa. And you bring up something that's a bit of a thread now, just picking up from Angeline and my earlier comments about the GDB and some of the gaps. That lack of a philosophy, that lack of a standard, means that we don't have a floor for what data governance framework should look like in our countries. But we're joined by Jenna, of course, and Jenna, with the Global Partnership, you've been working not just on the specific issues around data governance, but on a number of other areas that trying to bring about these normative frameworks. So I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about the Inclusive Data Charter, and then maybe also seeing as this conversation has had this other thread about bringing stakeholders together, being a bit more multi-stakeholder oriented, and getting more traction around advocacy. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how your work is bringing multiple stakeholders around the issue of data governance, and making sure that data governance frameworks in our countries are more responsive to the issues that face our public. Jenna.
Great, thanks, Mushiri. And it's been great to listen to the intervention so far. So first, just, as Mushiri said, I'm coming from the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And I'll briefly note that the Global Partnership is a network of hundreds of partners, including governments, civil society organizations, business, international organizations, and academic institutions all over the world. So it's quite broad and it's quite diverse in terms of cross-stakeholder, to your question. And what I was going to focus on today is an initiative called the Data Values Project that's been ongoing for the last 50 months or so. And the Data Values Project came out of a desire that we sort of heard from this broad and quite diverse global network. It's sort of summed up in some results from a recent partner survey, where close to 90% of our partners agreed that the data for development community needs a stronger common vision on data ethics, rights, and governance for equity. And that really reflects, and so we sort of took on that. We said, okay, so what does that mean? What is that vision going to look like? And how to define it? And so about 15 months ago, we launched a consultative process to sort of surface ideas and define what that common vision would be about. And once in the process of that and defining that agenda, then taking that on and transitioning that into a sort of multi-stakeholder global advocacy effort. So over the course of about a year, we heard from over 350 individuals from 63 countries on questions around data and power. What really came out was a strong desire and focus on centering diverse and underrepresented stories and expertise, and a real emphasis on those voices that aren't typically heard, that don't have power in discussions on questions of data inclusion and data governance. So what I'll do is I'll kind of highlight the key themes that we heard from that consultation, which are forming the basis of this agenda and which will soon be transitioned into an advocacy campaign. And then I want to focus in on the data governance piece of that, because it really echoes what we've already heard from the other speakers, particularly some of these questions on participation and inclusion. So there are three big themes that came out. The first is on agency in data. And that's really about people being empowered through their inclusion in data, that people should be able to define for themselves and for their own communities whether and how they're measured. That goes to how questions are asked, how data is collected, what questions are asked, and whether their views are really, and their experiences are being captured in official data and statistics and in other mechanisms. Secondly, is about accountability in data governance, which is really about a greater role for people in shaping how their data will be accessed, managed, and used, and greater accountability of the people who make those decisions and the people with power who make those decisions. And I'm going to zoom in on that in a minute or so. But the last pillar is about putting data into action. And that's really about, at the end of the day, that basis of trust and that possibility to realize to really unlock the value of data really comes down to decision makers actually using that data in decisions to deliver more equitable opportunities and outcomes. So there is a data use component, which I know that the Global Data Barometer touches on data use, and something that the open data community and the sort of data for development community has been wrestling with for a long, long time. And more work to be done there. So this focus, that we heard across, again, this really diverse range of actors, and not just in partners in the global partnership, but we took an effort to work with partners and their networks, their communities, so that we would be reaching beyond and beyond our kind of concentric circles of the people we know, to get a really diverse view of sort of what's needed going forward. And we came out with this notion that we need a fair data future, that, technology and datafication are moving so quickly. And while regulation and legislation are moving quickly and trying to keep up, and as Angeline highlighted, in the last 10 years, we've really seen an explosion of data legislation, data protection frameworks, et cetera. It's really still not keeping up with what we need. And if we want, and if our goal is, and that this diverse consultative process did emphasize sort of equity, moving towards a sort of equitable future, and looking toward a fair data future, there are certain sort of key steps that still really need to be taken in areas that are really important for advocacy. With respect to data governance in particular, one of the key points to come out is that while those formal institutions of data governance that we've discussed a lot on this call, so legislation, regulation, formal institutions, they're incredibly important for creating that framework for accountability and data governance. They're not sufficient on their own. And this gets to what Tamiwa was saying, and that it is the relationship and the interaction between those formal mechanisms of data governance and more informal participatory mechanisms that really generate a more accountable data governance. So that rather than conceiving of accountability as something that happens after the fact, a sort of check on decisions that have been made, was it made in the interests of people? Are there mechanisms of redress that now needs to be applied because people got harmed, their privacy was contravened? Rather, it's engaging people in affected communities in the earlier stages of decision-making and all along the way through various kinds of participatory mechanisms that ensures that data governance decisions that are being made on an ongoing basis are much more accountable to people. And this will then, create a situation where power is shifting more toward those people who are at risk of being exploited, who are already marginalized, who may experience a kind of reinforcement of structural inequalities through the production and use of data. It can serve as a corrective. In these consultations, though, it's also like, what do we mean by participatory data governance, right? So we heard a lot of really interesting stories and experiences and concrete examples of what that participation can look like. It's still a very new area, but to get much more concrete about it, it's mechanisms for consultation, ways of establishing task forces or committees or representative groups where representative communities can be consulted or involved in decision-making along the way. It's about also, setting up steering committees in Ghana, a steering committee that brings civil society actors into sort of government decision-making on the use of privately held data. It's committees that that address specific questions in specific projects, for example, on the use of data on gender-based violence in Latin America. And I think, examples of communities that are out in front. So the Indigenous data governance movement, for example, which is very active in places like Canada, New Zealand, in certain Latin American countries, where the Indigenous community has adopted their own principles for the governance of their own data, and has advocated with their own governments about what that means. So that is taking on and really taking control of your own community's data governance. And that then is another form of participatory data governance that sort of comes in and serves as a complement to those formal mechanisms of data governance, data protection, and legislation. This concept of participation, enabling a much more accountable data governance, is an area that I think we see an opportunity to push the envelope on advocacy. And just to come to the capability point, so to close on capability, if indeed we're advocating for people to be involved through participation in data governance, what capabilities are needed in order to do that? So we heard a lot about that from Tamiwa, and I don't want to repeat. And certainly, one natural thing is to emphasize, well, we need increased data literacy. People need to understand what it means to be giving up their data. What does it mean when my data is used, et cetera. One of the things that I think was so interesting when we produced an initial draft of the white paper for the Data Values Project and had a public consultation on it, one comment that we got back about the emphasis that we placed on data literacy as a foundation to enable all of these ideas was that not to put all of the onus on enabling people and communities to sort of better understand what it means to engage in their data, but also that the onus needs to be on official institutions to make those processes more accessible. So it's not just about data literacy, but also about the accessibility of those practices. And a good analogy is the participatory budgeting space. So participatory budgeting has been around for decades. And no one expects the ordinary community representative to be an accountant or to be trained in financial management or to understand micro and macroeconomics in order to engage in a discussion about budgeting that affects them and their community. It is that the discussion is accessible enough to them and meets them where they are, that they can participate and articulate the things that matter to them with respect to how data is going to be spent, or how, in this case, money is going to be spent in their community. And I think the same can be applied in data governance decisions. So how is data about me or my community potentially going to be used or not used? Or how is data going to be collected about me? How is it going to be stored? And that can be made, those questions and concepts can be made accessible. You can meet people where they are so that there are avenues for participation in data governance. And then just like a final point is that to recognize that participation doesn't mean that every person has to be involved all the time, right? Democracy is not about, it's not a sort of, we have evolved, it's not a sort of Greek idea that every person has a sort of say apart from their vote. There are ways of creating indirect mechanisms for participation where groups can nominate representatives to engage, where various mechanisms can be set up. And there's always a trade-off between making efficient decisions and enabling greater participation. And we recognize, right, that enabling greater participation may slow things down. And so there are some really challenging trade-offs to be addressed. And so it's not without challenges and not without difficult trade-offs. But our sort of sense from this broad consultation is that there is a desire on the part of individuals, communities, civil society groups, and governments to move in this direction, and even companies, and that there are good examples of this already being done, and possibilities to pursue a much more accountable data governance in the future. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenna. I think maybe the Data Values Project does provide some countries with a place to start on that conversation. Tommy, I was talking about, having a national philosophy, around that undergirds your data governance frameworks and all of that. And it's interesting to see that participation thread, being such a big part of this conversation. And then also, my apologies, inclusive data charter and the data values project in my mind are so adjacent that I found my brain switched to the inclusive data charter, but those are two pieces of work the partnership has been working on that are really complementary and really trying to advance this issue of making sure that people in the data they have their rights protected, and that when they're in the data, the decisions that are being made include them. And now with this conversation of the data values project, make sure that they are included they can participate in that discussion, in those decisions, whether or not their data is in that space. And I think that's some admirable work that the partnership is doing. Talking of participation, we have a few people have been giving us their ideas on this, what they think the state of data governance in their countries is. It's on the poll so far. I'm seeing on a score of 1 to 5, the slight majority scores their country as a 2, and then it's about 38%, with 31% scoring their countries as being at 3. 15% say the country is at 4, 8% say 5, and another 8% say 1. So far, our sample is scoring the state of data governance as a 2.8 out of 5. So maybe one of these days we might rerun this as a scientific poll and see the extent to which our participation can drive interesting feedback, subjective feedback on how the lived experience of the data governance in your country. Angeline, maybe that's a whole research area that we should start thinking about. But anyway, so Francis, you've been working on this data protection issue for a while. We've had a lot of conversations already that really touch on the frameworks, effectiveness, etc. So maybe, in 5 or so minutes, maybe you can tell us a bit about where you see the next steps being. What do countries need to be doing now? Given everything that we've talked about and all the work you've done in the past, where do countries need to put their attention? How do they need to respond to this growing issue, growing challenge, growing pain for better, stronger data governance frameworks in our countries? Francis.
Thank you very much for that question. So I think the first right thing that the countries are doing is actually enacting data protection laws and data protection policies. At the moment, can say over 50% of African countries, around a number of 32 out of 54 countries, have data protection laws, which is very good, which is, I can say, is a step in the right direction. Now, the question should be, now that the data protection laws are in place, then the thing we should be asking ourselves, are they being implemented, and how are they being implemented? At the end of the day, we should never lose sight to the fact that data protection law is an offshoot of the right to privacy. So privacy should be a priority. There are certain trends that may be seen where one may feel that the direction in which is implementation of data protection law and policy is being taken, it's pro-trade, pro-business, and the aspect of human rights and people and right to privacy is secondary. And that's a question that I believe that the continent will have to, countries in the continent will have to ask themselves in how they implement the data protection laws that have been enacted, and also in trade agreements that they get in. A few things that I think are necessary. While data protection law is also is a human rights law, we should remember that it's the idea behind it was to enable accountability in the use of personal information. So it's to enable the use of personal information in businesses, online, or in businesses, and in cross-border trade. So if that's the case, countries need to talk to each other. They need to cooperate. At the moment, African countries, we can't say that they're really doing that, but we can borrow a few examples from what the Council of Europe is doing. Council of Europe, not the European Council. Council of Europe is doing with Convention 108, where even some African countries are ratified, such as Mauritius, Tunisia, Senegal, Cape Verde, Burkina Faso. Okay, Burkina Faso and Morocco have been invited to the treaty. But basically, it helps in ensuring that whenever there's cross-border data transfers, there are adequate protections for the personal data of your citizens in the other territory that this personal data is being transferred to. And that's crucial, because now it won't be safeguards are being traded for money. There'll be assurances that these protections are available across the board. The other issue is implementation. Implementation at the moment, we can see it has started. I can testify, like in Kenya, we were not talking about data protection implementation 3 years ago, even 2 years ago, but right now, everyone is talking about the data protection, privacy, the data commissioner. So implementation is something that countries that have enacted the law have started taking up. I've seen it in Uganda. They even have a deadline for registration. In Kenya, registration for data commissioner, for data controllers and processors begins in the 14th of July, which you can say is a step in the right direction. However, implementation is affected by the third aspect. This other third aspect cuts two ways. It's something which is being done, but it's also something which hasn't been done to that level, and to the level that is required. And that is awareness. Awareness is necessary for people, for data service, for citizens to exercise their right to privacy. You need to be aware that actually this activity that is taking place is an infringement. For you to now write to the data commissioner or to write to the data controller or the data processor and tell them that you're doing this and this is wrong, and I will take action if no action is taken. So I feel like the concerns across, like, what countries are doing right, are also things that they need to continue doing, but to enhance, to take them to the next level. And that is enacting laws. Even as, like, speaking of Kenya, we enacted the law in 2019, but now we need to continue breaking it down into guidelines, guide notes, regulations, for even if it's for different sectors, to ensure that compliance is easier. And then there's the aspect of implementation. Now the duty bearers here are data controllers and data processors. Now that the law is there, they need to take action in ensuring that whatever they do, they implement data protection by design and by default, and that they implement the provisions of data protection, of the data protection frameworks that are in place. And now the third one, on education and awareness. The data controller, the duty bearers now on implementation are three: the data commissioner or the data protection authority, the continental scale, there's the data processors and the data controllers. They have a duty to educate the data subjects or individuals or the people in their societies on the provisions of these laws, and so that to empower them to be able to exercise it. Other than that, I think continent of my presentation.
Thank you, Francis. Apologies for the nudges as we come to the top of the hour. But you do bring up some really important points that have been echoed, and I think do present a stream, especially when it comes to then how do we move beyond having adopted a law. Where, like you said, we're in this space in some of our countries where we're post enactment of legislation, but there's still gaps in the institutions, in the awareness, in the capabilities side, as has been mentioned by a few others today. And I think that it really does seem like the work going forward is going to be about strengthening that, where the countries have gone beyond the enactment of legislation, and of course the advocacy for those places where it hasn't. And this conversation around, how do we make sure that there's a floor, so that there's a bare minimum and upon which these frameworks are designed and implemented. So yeah, I think this has been a really insightful conversation. Thank you very much for being with us. We've come to the top of the hour. From the Slido poll, 43% now gauge their countries as a 2. Up from 38, and the average score for data governance given by those on the poll today is a 2.7 out of 5. So I think whether that's as scientific as it could be is not the issue, but I do think it does bring us to a point where we can say, regardless, I think there is definitely more work to be done, and we need to do everything we can to make sure that our data governance frameworks are as responsive to our needs as citizens, and continue to protect the rights of individuals, especially, as Francis pointed out, the right to privacy, it is primary. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. It's been an amazing experience. If the panel could turn on their cameras and wave goodbye, then we will leave it at that. Yeah. So this has been recorded. It's on the live stream. Thank you very much. Please do go ahead and share it with your friends and have these conversations. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.